Welcome to the India Fintech Diaries, the only podcast focused exclusively on the Indian fintech market. I'm Elroy.
And I'm Hemant. In each episode, we dive into the latest trends, ideas, innovations, business models, and personalities that are shaping India's fintech landscape.
We also invite amazing guests who are innovators and industry players that are driving the change that is helping make financial services more modern, innovative, and inclusive in India. Come join us as we explore the changing landscape of fintech in India. Hello and welcome to another episode of India Fintech Diaries, the show where we talk about all things Indian fintech, innovations, and the technology shaping the financial world. I'm your host, Elroy.
And I'm your host, Hemant. We have a very exciting episode lined up, especially for those interested in payments and public transit systems. And this is an area, believe me, that there's not a lot of material online or there's not a lot of information online. So it'll be very, very interesting. And to deep dive into this topic, we are thrilled to have with us a true expert of this space, Manoj Sugathan. Manoj has over 30 years of experience in the payments industry, including a pivotal role in driving the growth of Visa's contactless solutions across Asia Pacific and beyond. Manoj, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Hemant and Elroy, for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that has been very close to my heart for over a decade. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Manoj. Great to have an expert like you on this topic. I was waiting for someone to come on this topic and speak on. So, to begin with, Manoj, before we jump into the topic itself, it would be great if you could just tell our listeners a little about yourself.
I've spent most of my life in the payment industry, not just professional life. If you take my entire life, most of the years are spent in the payment industry. However, I started my career as a programmer. Then I joined Verifone, a payment industry pioneer, some 30 years back. There I led the Asia Pacific Application Development Center based in Singapore that was responsible for developing payment terminal software for the entire region on hundreds of thousands of devices. Ironic as it may sound, I have a degree in computer science and learned to program in 7 languages: BASIC, Fortran, COBOL, Pascal, C, C++, and obviously machine language. But I haven't programmed for over 2 decades. And from Verifone, I moved to Visa Asia Pacific, again based in Singapore, and stayed there for over 2 decades and went on to lead the contactless and urban mobility team for Asia Pacific. Visa, where I spent most of my career, was a remarkable experience. I was able to be a part of a fantastic chain which changed how people pay with their Visa product. The first 10 years of my time at Visa, we worked really hard from moving people from magnetic swipe card swiping to smart card dipping. So that was step one. Funnily enough, the next decade, we worked really hard to move people from dip transactions, smart card dip transactions, to contactless. 2 big moves in 2 decades. Remember, this was a time where people used to use the Visa card for many, many decades using swipe. So that was a major change in the system. And it has been a tremendous success. Let me take my home market is Singapore. 98% of Visa face-to-face transactions now happen over contactless. And it made such an impact. PayWave, the original branding for Visa contactless payment, became a familiar verb in many markets. But when I look back at my career, the most important thing happened in the last 5 years: an explosive growth of open loop transit payments. The impact of this open loop transit payments was significant and to every stakeholder, which I'm happy to say is the topic of the day. Just to conclude my professional journey, in 2023, I have reached a point in my career where we were able to change how millions of consumers pay with their Visa product, not just at retail merchants, but in transit as well. And I thought it's a great time for me to take a break and to focus on a few other things. But I couldn't leave the industry entirely behind. Hence, I now introduce myself as a payment industry observer. And I very much actively observe it from the sidelines. That's a quick recap of what I have done over the years.
Manoj, that's been a remarkably interesting career. It must be something significant that actually motivated you to leave behind all these exciting things that you've been doing and to take a different path. So, what exactly prompted this change?
30 years later, few other things became important to me: philanthropy and travel. The first was about giving back to the society for all the wonderful things it has done for me. And second was a thing that was a dream from my early childhood: travel to over 100 countries and travel to every single continent. I'm happy to say both are going very well. Me and my family have set up and set up and funding a charity organization which focus on education and elder care for the underprivileged. And on the second one, I'm also making remarkable progress. So far, it has been 83 countries, 28 in 2024 itself. But there is still a long way to go.
Absolutely, Manoj. But before we move on to transit payments, I must say you are living a life that most of us would like to once we are done and achieved what you have achieved in your professional career. Having
Thank
said
you.
that, now let's let's not keep keep our discussion on these topics. We'll do maybe a separate podcast on how to plan for 100 countries once you've taken a break from your career. But for this episode, let's jump into the topic for the today and start with the basics. What is the difference between a open loop payments and closed loop payments in the context of transit system?
Sure. Let me start with closed loop transit payment systems. Let's look at this way. There is probably no other merchant category that insists that you buy a payment instrument, typically a card from them in advance, top it up with money, and then use it over days, weeks, months, or even an year. There is no merchant category that says to you other than the transit merchant category. Just imagine that every supermarket, clothing store, convenience store, petrol stations, entertainment outlets, and hundreds of merchants ask the same thing from you. You would end up carrying a suitcase full of cards every time you step out of the house and would have to lock up a sizable portion of your savings before you can go on with your daily life. That is why I say transit payment is unique. Most places they insist on purchasing and topping up a product. It could be a card, it could be a phone, and sometimes you actually even put a non-refundable deposit before you start using it. And in most cases, it works in a closed environment. Many times, it is just in the transit environment, and
Right.
that is why we sort of refer this as a closed loop payment. But of course, we can't blame the operator and agencies for it. Many decades back, when they are looking for an efficient mechanism to move large crowds through transit gates quickly, the payment industry, the financial institutions, the schemes did not have a solution. We're talking about 25 years back. So many transport operators went ahead and built their own transit focus or even transit exclusive solution, which at many times referred as a closed loop payment solution, as we mentioned earlier. The good news is the world has changed. Financial institutions now have fast, cost efficient, and extremely important interoperable payment solutions that can work at transit gates across the world. When I decided to participate in this podcast, I decided I will keep aside technical terms like EMV and ISO 14443 and type A, B, C, etc. aside. I'm trying not to delve into this thing. So, for our listeners, leaving aside all the technical jargons, my definition of open loop transit payments is simple. Your existing contactless bank cards, which you use every day, being straight away used in public transport, does not matter who the card issuer is, nor does it matter which financial institution takes care of the transit gates, acquire the transit gates, nor does it matter which city or country you are in. No special purchase needed, no top up needed, just turn up, tap, and ride. In simple words, open loop transit payment make the life of passengers very convenient, and it also offers them a choice. They can use any contactless bank card as they please.
Manoj, when I met you in Singapore last November, I'd just come from a back to back trip from Thailand. And when I was in Thailand, I got a chance to use the Bangkok Metro. And I could actually ride on the Bangkok Metro using my DBS Visa debit card. And it was pretty much seamless. And the best part was at the end of the day, I just got one consolidated bill for all the rides I took in that day,
which is directly debited from my bank account. So I was truly amazed by how seamlessly all of this worked. And it would be great if for our listeners, if you could simplify and walk us through how such a system works from a payments perspective.
Yeah, the transaction flow when you use a contactless bank card at transit gates, it's slightly different, or it is significantly different from how it is used at a retail merchant.
Right.
The retail flow doesn't work because, as you know, when you use your card at a retail merchant, transaction takes anywhere between 5 to 15 seconds to complete. Most transit systems would want to let 2 to 3 passengers every second through the gate. So obviously that process doesn't work. So let's take a real world example. I'll talk about a simple, straightforward example on how transit solutions are implemented. There are still many ways of implementing it, but something that has been used extensively. Let's start with a simple example of a metro ride. Enter at one station and exit in another station. When a token, be it a physical card, a mobile phone running one of the pays, or a wearable, is tapped at the transit gate when the passenger enters the public transport, let's say at station A, the first thing the gate does is to ensure the product is genuine. This is done using some payment industry standard public key cryptography functions, which is built into all open loop products, all contactless bank cards from domestic and international schemes. Once the product is authenticated and some basic check passes right at the transit gate, like whether the card is expired, whether the product is being in the negative list, the gate opens, the passenger is let in. The tap information is sent to the back office. The passenger then completes the journey and exit the network at, let's say, station B. The exit tap information is also sent to the back office. The back office, with the information received from the entry and exit tabs, let's look at a few additional pieces of information. Station ID and time of the day
Right.
can determine what the fare is. In the real world example, this could be a lot more information. There are cryptographic information that is sent across, but let's not get into the finer details. So let's simply start with two. The station ID, which helps determine the journey, in our example, referred as station A or B, it could be referred as a numeric value. So based on that thing, it looks up at a table and says, okay, this journey is worth X. And then I mentioned about the time of the day as another example, because some operators do have different peak and off peak fares. In fact, there could be several parameters in a complex multimodal network that determines the fare, but we'll not go into those things. At the end, the fare is determined, and the back office can trigger a payment transaction, which looks like a retail transaction. It's not necessary the financial transaction is sent online immediately after the journey is complete. Some operators would wait until the end of day to see if there are multiple journeys and then combine those fares. Ultimately, several business rules come into play on how a financial transaction is originating. But at a higher level, this is what happens when an open loop transaction happens. The passenger will see a line in their monthly statement saying that they've been charged an amount for that ride. In this example, let's talk about one ride. Most operators adopting open loop typically provides a website or an app where the passenger can look at the details of the journey, because in the monthly statement, if you see there is a single amount X, what does this X represent? When did I take this journey? From where to where did I take this journey? So that website or the app the transit operator runs gives a lot more information to the consumer. This is important when journeys are aggregated by the operator, like multiple journey fares are combined into one financial transaction. I might have taken 3 rides today. So the website or the app also helps address many concerns passengers have, like, am I wrongly charged? What is this journey? Because typically you see your monthly statement after 30 days. Where exactly did I go on 3rd of last month? The information is very clearly presented to the passenger, and this brings in transparency and addresses any passenger concerns. Like I mentioned earlier, a transit transaction very much looks like a retail transaction. The financial transaction looks like a retail transaction. Hence, the existing systems used by financial institutions mostly stay the same. The financial aspect that takes care of the four party model, the cardholder, issuer, acquirer, merchant. In this case, the merchant is a transit operator, also remains the same. The beauty of this approach is the financial systems, the processes, the flows that have been in existence for decades will mostly remain this same, keeping the cost down. The biggest advantage is that there is no need to issue millions of new transit specific cards and incur costs. The existing cards and other forms of payment, like I mentioned, wearables, Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, Android Pay, it doesn't matter. All of them will work at transit gates. Another important aspect is solution provider readiness. 15
Right.
years after the first open loop transit implementation was done by Visa at the Kuala Lumpur International Airport Express, where things were built from scratch, things have changed a lot. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of solution providers, global, regional, and country specific, who have ready made transit solutions from gates to back office to white label apps that the operators can use out of the box. So the challenges with respect to implementation, it is gone, it has disappeared a lot.
Very, very interesting, Manoj. This is super. Manoj, when I was a young adult, I had these nightmares where I go to buy something and I don't have enough money in my account. Now imagine this the same thing happens when I'm trying to enter a metro and I tap my card. Now how is the scenario handled? Of course not for from my personal perspective. It just means I should have been more careful with my money. But from the transit operator's perspective, how is the scenario handled?
A very interesting question. That is a very interesting question because when we talk about open loop transit payments, the biggest boogeyman in the room is something called the first right risk. Actually, that's a misnomer. Basically, it points out to the fact that the transaction, the example we just talked about, the person enters station A, leaves at station B, but the fare is calculated after the station person leaves station B, and then a financial transaction is done, and there is it might be very unlikely, but there is a possibility of a declined transaction, and the transit operator and agency might lose a fare. This has been a fear that has been there always. Like I said, it may not be the first ride, it could be the 10th ride. That's why I said the first ride risk, the wording is a misnomer. But I can confidently tell you that the schemes and the financial institutions who are on who are the other stakeholders in the ecosystem have addressed this issue over a decade back. The participants in the ecosystem have a customized approach to addressing this problem, many times at a country level. After all, ticket sizes and risks vary from country to country. I'm happy to say that the problem has been addressed for a market in India as well, but we'll come to that thing a little bit later. Ultimately, this is done using a risk sharing mechanism.
Manoj, let's put our lens on the costs involved. Can you shed some light on the cost implications for the transit operators to accept contactless payments compared to closed loop systems?
As I described earlier, the four party model still remains the same. Anybody who has worked in the credit card or debit card industry knows how a typical financial transaction flow works and who makes what. For the transit transaction, that remains the same. But obviously, the scale is a little bit different. When you go and make a retail purchase, typically the ticket sizes are bigger. But as you
Correct.
look at transit transaction, ticket sizes are much smaller, but it's typically frequent transactions. So assuming that every journey results in a financial transaction, a person could have, let's say, on a 22 working day, a person could have 44 financial transactions, each of them of a smaller ticket size. Obviously, the ticket size is so small compared with retail. The current business model sometimes needs to be tweaked to make this happen. I go back to the thing. This has been running for over 15 years. The business models have been adjusted. The stakeholders have worked on the business model. It has been adjusted. And like I mentioned, over 900 transit operators around the world are already accepting it. Where tickets, for example, if you go to a city like London, ticket would run into many pounds. And if you go to a place like Vietnam, it would be a few US cents, a typical transaction amount. So the model has been adjusted to make sure it works at bigger ticket size or smaller ticket size, but always its ticket sizes are smaller than a typical retail ticket size.
And Manoj, I would love to know how widely this open loop tap and go payment system has been adopted. Do you have any statistics or insights on those numbers?
The industry, the schemes typically publishes this information. There are regular white papers and publicly available information that is available. From that, I see there are close to 900 programs that already accept open loop transit payments. Many big cities are already doing it. This already works in most modes of public transport: buses, ferries, cable cars, trams, and obviously metros. Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Sydney, Bangkok, Hong Kong, London, New York, Beijing are all examples where this is happening, and some of them over a decade. In fact, billions of transactions, that's with a B, has already happened. So I would say in most places, this has become business as usual. And the pipeline is also pretty strong. So when I look forward 3 years, 5 years, this will become just like a retail acceptance where you would travel in your country or around the world using your financial institutions contactless bank card, and you will just turn up in the local transit and start riding.
Manoj, a lot of transit operators around the world already have long running closed loop programs, for example, the Octopus card in Hong Kong. From a transit operator's point of view, why would they consider either moving away from a closed loop program or complementing a closed loop program that's already working well? What's the real value in switching to an open loop system?
When it comes to open loop transit uh, payments, I would summarize the whole thing in two words: consumer choice. When you walk into most retail merchants as a consumer, you get a choice of payments, UPI options, card versus phones, credit versus debit, domestic versus international, dip versus contactless versus QR, and whatnot. Transit is probably the only merchant that doesn't offer this at the same scale. How things are changing, offering consumer choice of payments is becoming a hygiene factor everywhere. While transit operators may not be able to offer all the choices I mentioned earlier, like, for example, QR, due to performance challenges, it just doesn't make sense to restrict efficient payment mechanism. Interestingly, solution providers also have readied all-in-one transit solutions combining many payment options. So back to consumer choice. This is going to drive coexistence, another keyword. So it's no more about closed loop versus open loop. It is about closed loop and open loop. And in fact, when I talked about over 900 implementations around the world, most of them are closed loop and open loop coexisting. And basically, solution providers are basically ready for it. Why are transit operators doing it? Most transit operators, if you ask them, the payment system is not their number one priority. Their priority is to run trains and buses on time and in an efficient manner. So, transit payments is just to make the whole process work. And time has proven that open loop transit payments actually make this process a lot more efficient, lot more cost effective. And transit operators talk to each other, they look at what are happening around the world, they learn from other people's experience, and there is a little bit of peer pressure as well. When passengers says, I'm able to go to XYZ city and I'm able to use my contactless bank card there, why am I not able to use it in my city? So it's a combination of all those things: a better business case, providing consumer choice, a little bit of peer pressure. All these pieces are bringing together this astonishing number of upgrades that are happening. And like I said, most cases it is open loop and closed loop that are coexisting, even though the closed loop usage over time will start declining and open loop will take over, because ultimately that is what the consumers need.
Manoj, let's talk about some implementation challenges. Now, transit agencies globally vary so much in terms of their infra and tech readiness. What would you say are the biggest barriers to adopting the tap and go model in emerging markets?
I mean, let's try to look at it from two aspects. Let's look at the issuing readiness, the card readiness, and let's look at the acceptance readiness. Let's start with the card aspect of it. If the cities which I talked about, when you go to London or Singapore or Hong Kong, there are enough contactless bank cards. So the issuance aspect is ready. These cards will work in transit on day one without any issues. So most consumers have a contactless bank card and they're ready to go. But then there are emerging markets where this is not the case. There are not enough contactless bank cards in some of the emerging markets. One of the markets where, when I was at Visa, we worked very actively was Vietnam. Not everybody who takes public transport has a contactless bank card. So that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. And then immediately everybody will point out, oh, these are people at the bottom of the pyramid. They could never get a credit or a debit card. How would you address this challenge? And that is where prepaid comes into play. We have actually piloted a prepaid solution in Vietnam. When we did an open loop pilot in Vietnam, we piloted prepaid issuance in Vietnam, where passengers can get a prepaid card which they can top up and use at public transport. When I look at the benefits of open loop payments for the entire ecosystem, I think this is one aspect I would be really looking forward, because this particular card, a financial instrument, can go into the hands of a large number of people. Even though it is issued as a transit loan card initially, technically this is an open loop product. It works in retail. We can actually welcome millions, dare I say, billions of people into the payment ecosystem by using transit prepaid cards. So that's the first aspect. On the acceptance side, on the transit gates and things of that sort, there had been challenges. The beauty of the whole system is now, 15 years later, there is a huge ecosystem that's ready, the solution providers that are ready to provide solutions. And one of the things that I've seen in a big way is a migration to cloud-based systems. Low capex, sometimes no capex cloud-based system. A transit operator can go to a solution provider, get the readers that can be put at buses or train stations, but the entire back office is running on the cloud. There is no hardware to purchase, no systems to run. Everything is taken care. I think the world is slightly moving on to that one. I would say big transit operators who takes care of millions of passengers probably still would decide to run their own systems. But when it comes to smaller transit operators, a bus operator with tens or hundreds of buses, it's not worth for them to run a huge server to do open loop transit. And that is exactly where the cloud solutions come into play. So that's the other part, like I said, issuing and the acceptance part. Challenges did exist a while back, but again, it is becoming a pretty mature industry where ready-made solutions are available, and many of these solutions are what we call as certified or approved by the schemes and sometimes third parties, making sure that they're ready to go, well tested and secure, and ready to go on day one.
Yeah, a related question, Manoj. So, in the regions with low financial inclusion or limited access to banking services, how do we ensure that tap to pay systems remain accessible for the banked or unbanked? And on a related note, how can we push digital payments while still keeping cash and traditional methods available for those who rely on them so that they can use transit?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, prepaid cards have come into play. And in fact, while I talked about Vietnam earlier, it was a smaller pilot. But over the last few years, things have been scaled up in a big way, where a large number of transit prepaid cards have been issued to consumers. And remember, this is still an open loop card. While the consumer might get the card, the passenger might get the card because they want to ride the trains or buses. Later, they realize that they have a product that can be used at any merchant. So suddenly you have a new entrant into the financial system. So that's one thing that is happening. I talked earlier about another thing, consumer choice. Ultimately, from a transit operator's point, consumers would have to be given a choice. Cash payments are accepted in certain transit operators, but the cost of accepting cash in transit systems are relatively high, and most transit operators want to get rid of it. We have seen it in many markets that is happening. But in markets where digital transaction penetration is still low, this could take a while. But again, I go back to this thing, coexistence. From a transit operator's point, things need to coexist for the near future, for the next many years before they can actually settle down to one payment mechanism. That can happen only when everybody else has got access to that same payment mechanism.
Manoj, let's move the focus to India for a bit. Now, as you know, very recently the latest metro line, Line 3, opened up in Mumbai, which is a completely underground line. It's a marvelous feat of engineering, and eventually it will connect Seeps to Kolaba. But when it launched, to my surprise, I needed a brand new app just to buy tickets on this new metro, making the grand total of rail transit apps I need just to travel the city of Mumbai to be almost four, which is UTS for suburban rails, Paytm or PhonePe for Metro 1, and the transitors' own respective apps for Metro 7 and Metro 3. And I'll also have to buy a fresh ticket whenever I'm switching lines simply because there's no seamless tap and go, even though there is NCMC acceptance. Some of the lines are not yet set up for NCMC acceptance. Now, this was in very stark contrast to what I saw in Singapore when I visited in November, where I could seamlessly tap and go across metros and buses using my debit card. As India upgrades its urban transit infrastructure across the country, and which is a number of projects that are happening right now, what challenges do you see it facing in terms of adopting the tap and go account based ticketing system?
One of the most eye opening moments I had using open loop transit is when I traveled to Tashkent in Uzbekistan. That was the last place I was expecting that I can use my Singapore issued contactless bank card to ride public transport. I was expecting that to happen in London and Hong Kong and Bangkok, and it has always happened. But I wasn't expecting this in Tashkent. And that sort of told me this solution is ready for the whole world. Coming back to India, I think my observation is that the industry is just looking for some regulatory clarity. Once that is settled, I eagerly look forward to seeing open loop acceptance proliferating in India immediately after that thing. After which, using a domestic or international credit card or debit card or prepaid card for transit will become a norm, and the same card will work across cities. There is no transport operator specific card or city specific card that will be needed. One card that will work everywhere, not just in one country but across the world.
Manoj, earlier you mentioned, and let me look at my notes, right? You mentioned that Open Loop is working in big cities like Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Sydney, Bangkok, Hong Kong, London, New York, and even Beijing. Speaking of cities, is this solution only applicable for major metros, or do you see it being implemented in smaller cities that are just beginning to develop public transport infrastructure? I think this is especially important since a lot of transit activities and transit infrastructure build outs are happening in smaller Indian cities today.
I'm sorry that dropped some big names out there because I mean one aspect these were massive implementation touching millions of people, but I do understand now that it probably has given an impression that open loop transit is actually beneficial only for bigger cities and it can be built on bigger cities alone. That's not really true. Let me take of two examples which I have encountered. One I was involved, the other one I just observed. The first one is a early pilot in Vietnam a few years back in selected number of buses, hundreds of buses. This solution was implemented. Remember, it's a a really small scale compared with a Singapore or a Hong Kong or a London implementation, much smaller, a small number of buses, and that worked beautifully. And the other example which I want to bring up is even more astonishing. There is a small town outside London. We all know London did adopt open loop transactions and
Correct.
everything is working wonderfully. But there is a small town outside London called Guildford. Obviously, they couldn't go ahead and do a massive implementation because at that point they have a total of 12 buses. But since this has happened in London, they didn't have much choice other than to enable this thing. They found a solution provider. They basically adopted a cloud based solution. So they didn't have to buy a piece of hardware to run a server or nothing. At the end of the day, they use a web based solution to get access to the details, how many rides were made, what is the total fare, and all those details. So when it comes to open loop, it is not about big cities, it is equally about small cities. So, for example, in India, we know there are a lot of bus companies, not a large number of buses, they don't have thousands of buses. But how would they ever adopt open loop? And I think a cloud based solution will come into play. And my understanding of the Indian market working with the local stakeholders, many of them have actually built similar solutions currently being deployed outside India. And I'm pretty sure they would be able to bring it to the local market once that regulatory clarity comes into play.
Manoj, another related question. So, when I travel in Mumbai quite often, right, in most cases, I'm using some form of QR ticket to actually travel. And you must have firsthand seen the rise of QR payments and QR ticketing in Southeast Asia. So, based on your experience, what are your views on the strengths and challenges of QR ticketing versus open loop payments?
Personally, I'm not a big believer of QR payments in high throughput mass transit systems. Yes, if there is a particular service, say an airport express bus with some occasional passengers, QR should work well. But trying to get
Right.
2, 3 passengers every second through a transit gate at a big metro using QR, it's not at all possible. Cities have tried out and later reverted to contactless. While QR scanning can be relatively fast because that's what people generally focus on, oh, I can scan QR as fast as contactless, probably still not as fast as open loop. So ultimately, I would say it's just a matter of performance, and currently the numbers doesn't add up.
Got it. So, Manoj, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today. It has been fascinating to hear about developments in the transit payments. Before we close, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners on the future of tap and go payments in public transportation?
First of all, it was great talking to you about this favorite topic of mine. While I have left the industry for a couple of years, it's the whole tap and pay, whether it is in retail or transit. I do it on an everyday basis. So, and millions of customers do it on an everyday basis. So, when I look back, it is actually business as usual. Earlier, I talked about markets like Singapore, where majority of the retail transactions are happening over contactless interface. So that is already happening, and we are seeing increasingly the same thing happening in the transit space as well. The same bank card, the contactless bank card, people are tapping and riding in public transport. So I would say that it has reached escape velocity. Yes, some markets are slightly behind, but look forward a few more years. You should be able to travel anywhere in the world and use your Indian issued credit or debit card to ride local transport without any issues. I would say a kind of that day will come really, really quickly. So it's just not a matter of if anymore, it's a matter of when. And in many cities, the when is come and gone. It's already happening. There are other cities, it might take a few more years.
Absolutely. And Manoj, I think it must help with, for example, your 100 country target. So every year you travel to different countries and you are able to see a lot of the technology that you have worked on actually in play and expanding to places and countries that you thought is going to take a lot of time, but it has already reached there. So that must be a different feeling altogether.
Yep. It's still a pleasant surprise, like I mentioned, when I saw the visa transit implementations in Central Asia a few years back in some of the CIS markets. It's happening everywhere, and I mean today it might not be 100% because at a metro I still need to see whether okay do they take visa or not. But a few years later, yep, I would walk in without any hesitation, tapping my visa card or phone at those transit gates in a faraway land.
On that very positive and hopeful note, and it is very important for India as well and the world as well, where we are working on multiple metro lines, and we hope that this gets implemented across all metros that we are working on, right?
Yeah. India is actually in a good position because, unlike many other cities where existing metros and a lot of old technology is still there, there are very many new metros that are coming up in India, which could adopt open loop contactless, open loop transit payments on day one without any carrying any backlog. So that would be a great opportunity. And I hope to see this happening in India very soon. And I hope to tap my contactless bank card in India as well.
Absolutely, Manoj. Hope is growth. So that's it from India FinTech Diaries. Do log on to our website, indiafintechdiaries.com, for show notes and other exclusive content. If you have enjoyed this show, don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends. And stay tuned for more discussion on the latest in FinTech. Until next time, stay happy, stay safe.